There's a moment, and most people in this room have already lived it, where the person who spent their entire life feeling everything for everyone goes completely quiet inside, not broken, not cold, quiet, and the people around them panic. They say, "You've changed." They say, "You're not the same person." And they're right. Because the version of you that kept pouring from an empty cup, that kept absorbing everyone else's chaos and calling it love, that version had to die for the real one to show up. What I'm going to show you today is that the empath who stops caring isn't having a breakdown. They're having the most important awakening of their life, and the world just doesn't have a script for it yet. There is a version of caring that looks beautiful on the surface. It looks like loyalty. It looks like sacrifice. It looks like the kind of person everyone wants in their corner, the one who shows up, who listens, who feels things deeply enough to sit in the dark with someone else just so they don't have to sit there alone. And for a long time, maybe your whole life, you wore that as a badge. You were the one who cared, the reliable one, the emotionally available one, the one people called at 2 a.m., the one who never said, "I'm too tired for this." And somewhere in the middle of all that giving, something happened that nobody around you noticed. And honestly, something you didn't notice either. Caring stopped being something you did and became something you were. That is the trap, not the caring itself. The caring is not the problem. The problem is the moment it fused with your identity so completely that you could no longer tell the difference between genuine compassion and compulsive self-sacrifice. You started showing up for people not because it filled you, but because not showing up felt like a threat to who you were. If you didn't care, who were you? If you stopped absorbing, stopped fixing, stopped holding everyone else's emotional weight, what was left? That question terrified you, so you never asked it. You just kept going, kept giving, kept making yourself available to people who had quietly learned that you would never say no. And here is what nobody talks about. The people around an empath are not always conscious of what they're doing. Most of them are not malicious. They are simply following the path of least resistance. You made it easy to take. You made it comfortable to unload. You responded to their chaos with calm, to their anger with understanding, to their inconsistency with patience. And in doing that, consistently, repeatedly over years, you trained everyone in your life to see your empathy not as a gift you were choosing to give, but as a resource they were entitled to access. That is not love. That is a dynamic. And dynamics, once established, are almost invisible to everyone inside them. Think about the first time you felt it, that slow, heavy exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. You could rest for 8 hours and wake up already drained, not because life was hard, but because you were running an emotional operation around the clock that nobody else could see. You were tracking moods, reading silences, preemptively softening situations before they became conflicts. You were doing emotional labor that wasn't yours to do, and you were doing it automatically the way other people breathe. It had become reflex, and reflex doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't calculate cost. It just fires. That reflex was built early. For most empaths, it wasn't born out of abundance. It was born out of necessity. At some point in your life, probably long before you had the language to understand it, you learned that your emotional attunement kept things safe. Maybe it kept a parent calm. Maybe it kept the peace in a house that didn't have much of it. Maybe it meant you could predict the shift in someone's mood before it became a storm, and prediction meant protection. So your nervous system got very, very good at reading people. It became a survival skill. And survival skills don't retire just because the danger is gone. They stay. They adapt. They follow you into every relationship, every friendship, every workplace, and they keep doing the job they were built to do, even when there is no longer any threat to manage. This is where the trap fully closes, because now you are an adult, in relationships that are supposed to be reciprocal, carrying a nervous system wired for emotional rescue. You are not choosing to overgive. You are not choosing to people please. You are executing a program that was written for a different time, a different place, a different version of danger. And nobody handed you the manual that said you were allowed to rewrite it. There is something that happens when an empath goes quiet. Not the quiet of defeat, not the silence of someone who has given up or checked out or simply run out of things to say. A different kind of quiet. a settled, deliberate, unshakable stillness that comes from somewhere so deep inside a person that it doesn't respond to provocation the way it used to. And the moment the people around you encounter that silence for the first time, the ones who have spent years getting a reaction from you, getting warmth from you, getting that familiar anxious availability that made them feel powerful without ever admitting it, they do not respond with peace. They respond with panic. And that panic will tell you everything you need to know. Watch what happens when you stop reacting. Not when you become cold, not when you become cruel, simply when you become still. The person who used to throw emotional grenades and watch you scramble to defuse them suddenly has nothing to work with. The person who relied on your guilt, your over-explanation, your compulsive need to fix the discomfort in the room, they suddenly find themselves standing in front of someone they don't recognize. And unfamiliarity, for people who have been feeding off your energy, is not just uncomfortable, it is destabilizing, because your reaction was never just a response to them. Your reaction was their mirror. Your anxiety validated their drama. Your empathy confirmed their narrative. Your constant emotional output gave them something to orient around, push against, pull toward. You were the emotional center of gravity in those dynamics, and gravity, when it disappears, doesn't leave things floating peacefully. It leaves things falling. This is the part no one prepares you for. You spend so long believing that your silence will bring relief to you, and maybe even to them. You imagine that if you simply stop engaging with the chaos, things will settle. What actually happens is that the chaos escalates before it settles, if it settles at all. The person who fed off your reactivity will push harder when they stop getting the response they're used to. They will interpret your stillness as hostility. They will call it passive aggression. They will tell you that you're being distant, that something is wrong with you, that you've become someone unrecognizable. They will try every key they have ever used to unlock your emotional availability, guilt, accusation, sudden vulnerability, manufactured crisis, and because they are not reacting to your silence out of malice. They are reacting to it out of dependency. And dependency, when its source is removed, does not go quietly. What you need to understand is that your emotional output was never just kindness in those relationships. It was currency. Every empathetic response, every rushed reassurance, every time you absorbed someone's projected mood without naming it, that was a transaction, even if you never agreed to the terms. You were paying into a system that had been built around your willingness to give, and the people inside that system had structured their entire emotional economy around your deposits. Your silence is not a withdrawal. It is the realization that the account was never yours to manage in the first place. But to them, it feels like theft, and so they fear it. They fear your stillness because it holds up a mirror they have never had to look into before. When you were reactive, they could focus on your reaction. When you were anxious, they could focus on your anxiety. When you were over-explaining, they could interrupt, redirect, manipulate the narrative. Your stillness removes all of that. It strips the dynamic down to its bare structure. And what they see in that structure, when they're honest enough to look, is that the entire relationship was built on your movement, not theirs. You were the one doing the emotional work. You were the one keeping things alive. You were the engine, and they were passengers who had convinced themselves they were driving. That stillness you have found is not emptiness. It is not absence. It is not the closing off of a heart that once felt everything. It is the first real boundary you have ever drawn with your entire body, your entire nervous system, your entire being. Not a rule you set, not a conversation you had, but a state of being that communicates without a single word, that you are no longer available to be the emotional infrastructure for someone else's unexamined life. There is a death that happens in broad daylight. No funeral, no announcement, no moment where the world pauses to acknowledge that something fundamental has shifted inside a person. It happens quietly, usually in the middle of an ordinary day, sometimes in the middle of a conversation you have had 100 times before, and this time something inside you simply does not fire. The familiar guilt doesn't arrive on schedule. The anxiety that used to flood your chest when someone was disappointed in you stays silent. The impulse to fix, to smooth, to contort yourself into whatever shape the moment is demanding from you, it just doesn't come. And for a second, maybe longer, you stand there waiting for it. because you have been that person for so long that its absence feels like something is wrong. It is not wrong. It is the beginning of the most important ending of your life. What is actually dying is not your empathy. Let that land. The thing that is dissolving, the version of you that is quietly ceasing to operate, is not the part of you that feels deeply or loves fiercely or connects authentically. That part is not going anywhere. What is dying is the performance, the constructed self that was built layer by layer, year by year, out of other people's needs and your own fear of what would happen if you didn't meet them. That self was never really you. It was an adaptation, a remarkably sophisticated, deeply practiced, socially rewarded adaptation, but an adaptation nonetheless. A version of you that learned to lead with sensitivity as a shield, to make yourself indispensable as a form of self-protection, to keep everyone around you emotionally regulated because a regulated room felt safer than an unpredictable one. That constructed self served a purpose once. It is important to say that clearly without judgment because so many people who reach this stage carry an enormous amount of shame about who they used to be. The overgiver, the people pleaser, the one who said yes when every cell in their body was screaming no. That person was not weak. That person was surviving. That person was doing the only thing that made sense, given what they had been taught about love, about safety, about what they had to be in order to deserve a place in someone else's life. You do not bury that version of yourself with contempt. You bury them with understanding, but you do bury them, because here is what happens when you keep that old self alive past its expiration. And this is the part that most conversations about empathy never touch. When you continue to operate from that constructed identity long after you have begun to see it clearly, long after you understand the mechanics of why you do what you do, it stops being survival and starts being self-betrayal. At a certain point, the awareness itself becomes the responsibility. You cannot unsee the pattern. You cannot unknow the dynamic. You cannot look at a situation where you are shrinking yourself to manage someone else's emotional state and genuinely believe it is just who you are. Once you have that awareness, continuing the old behavior is a choice, and choices carry weight in a way that unconscious patterns do not. This is the threshold where the death becomes real, because choosing to let the old self die means tolerating the discomfort of who you are in the in-between. The person you are after the old self begins to dissolve and before the new one has fully taken shape. That in-between is not comfortable. It is not poetic in real time, even if it sounds poetic in retrospect. In real time, it feels like dislocation. It feels like you have removed the scaffolding from a building that is still standing, still functional, still occupied, and now you are just watching it hold its own weight for the first time and not entirely sure it will. Relationships that were built around your old self will shake. Some will fall. Not because you became someone worse, but because they were never built on the real you to begin with. And the people who walk away during that in-between, the ones who cannot tolerate the version of you that no longer shrinks, no longer apologizes for existing, no longer performs warmth on demand. Their leaving is not a loss you should grieve the way you once would have. Their leaving is the old self taking its people with it on the way out. Let them go, not with bitterness, not with the satisfaction of someone who has finally proven a point, but with the calm recognition that some relationships were only ever a contract between them and the version of you that no longer exists. There is a word that gets weaponized against empaths the moment they begin to change. The moment you stop absorbing everything. The moment you start declining invitations to carry weight that was never yours. The moment you introduce any form of limit into a relationship that previously had none. Someone will look at you and say you have built a wall. They will say it with concern in their voice, sometimes with hurt, sometimes with the particular kind of accusation that is designed to sound like worry but functions like pressure. And because you are who you are, because your entire nervous system was trained to respond to the perception of having caused someone pain, that word will land. Wall, cold, closed off, unavailable. And for a moment, maybe longer, you will wonder if they are right. They are not right. But the fact that you wonder is exactly why this conversation needs to happen. A wall and a boundary are not the same structure. They are not even close to the same thing, and confusing them or allowing other people to conflate them deliberately is one of the primary ways that empaths are pulled back into dynamics they have already begun to outgrow. A wall is built from fear. It is erected reactively, usually after damage, and its entire purpose is to keep everything out. The good and the bad, the safe and the unsafe, the nourishing and the toxic. A wall does not discriminate. It does not assess. It simply blocks. And yes, some people who have been deeply hurt do build walls. That is a real thing. That is a trauma response that deserves compassion, not judgment. But that is not what is happening when a sovereign person draws a boundary. Not even close. A boundary is built from clarity. It comes not from fear of what might come in, but from a deep and settled understanding of what you are and are not willing to participate in. It is not a reaction to a specific person or a specific wound. It is a position, a value made structural. It says, not with aggression, not with defensiveness, but with a kind of unshakable calm. This is where I end and where you begin, and I am no longer willing to blur that line for the sake of your comfort. That is not coldness. That is the most honest thing a person can bring to a relationship. And the people who experience your boundaries as walls are almost always the people who benefited most from the absence of them. This is the part that requires you to sit with some discomfort, because the person calling your boundary a wall is rarely a stranger. It is usually someone close, someone you love or have loved, someone whose opinion of you carries weight, and they are not necessarily lying when they say it hurts. It probably does hurt them. Your boundary is genuinely inconvenient for the version of the relationship they preferred, the version where you were fully permeable, where your limits were negotiable, where they could reliably count on your guilt to override your judgment. Your boundary disrupts that, and disruption, for someone who has never had to adjust their behavior around your needs before, can genuinely feel like rejection. That feeling is real. Your responsibility for it is not. Sovereignty is a word worth sitting with. Not independence in the sense of isolation, not self-sufficiency as a form of armor, but sovereignty in its truest sense, the state of being the highest authority over your own inner world. An empath who has reached sovereignty is not someone who has stopped feeling. They are someone who has stopped allowing other people's feelings to automatically override their own. That is a profound shift. It rewires the entire way you move through relationships. You can still feel deeply. You can still be present. You can still offer genuine warmth and connection, but you do it from a place of choice rather than compulsion, from fullness rather than fear, from a self that is intact rather than one that is constantly being redistributed among everyone who reaches for it. The shutdown and the sovereign can look identical from the outside in certain moments. Both involve stillness. Both involve not reacting. Both can appear to the untrained eye as distance. But the internal experience is completely different. Shutdown is numbness. It is the emotional system going offline because it has been overwhelmed past its capacity. It is the psyche's emergency brake, and it comes with its own kind of pain, a flatness, a dissociation, a sense of being behind glass while life happens in front of you. Sovereignty is the opposite of that. It is presence so complete, self-awareness so grounded that you can be in the middle of someone else's storm and remain entirely yourself, not unmoved, entirely yourself. Nobody tells you that healing is disorienting to witness. Nobody prepares the people around you for what it looks like when someone who has spent their entire life being emotionally available, endlessly accommodating, reflexively warm, suddenly starts taking up their own space. There is no announcement. There is no gradual telegraph transition where the people in your life can slowly adjust their expectations and update their understanding of who you are. There is just a day or a series of days where you begin to respond to life differently, where the automatic yes becomes a pause, where the familiar rush to comfort someone becomes a stillness that lets them sit with their own discomfort, where the performance of warmth, the kind that was never really warmth at all but anxiety wearing warmth's clothing, simply stops. And to the outside world, every single one of those changes looks like something has gone wrong with you. This is the awakening no one warns you about, not the internal experience of it. There is plenty of language for that, plenty of frameworks and spiritual narratives and psychological models that describe what it feels like from the inside to begin shedding a constructed self. What there is almost no language for is the social experience of it, the way the people around you respond to your growth as though it is a symptom, the way your increased self-awareness gets read as selfishness, the way your new stillness gets diagnosed as depression by people who were comfortable with your anxiety because your anxiety was useful to them, the way your boundaries get framed as emotional unavailability by people who never once asked whether you were available to yourself. Healing, in its early and middle stages, does not look like the version sold in popular culture. It does not look like a person radiating peace, moving through their days with effortless grace, loving everyone from a place of pure abundance. Real healing, the kind that happens at the bone level, at the nervous system level, at the level of identity itself, is awkward. It is uneven. It involves days where you overcorrect, where the pendulum swings hard away from who you used to be because you are still calibrating, still learning where the real center is. It involves saying no and then feeling the full weight of other people's disappointment without immediately collapsing under it. It involves sitting across from someone you love and recognizing a dynamic that you cannot unsee, and choosing not to play your part in it even though every old pattern in your body is pulling you back toward the familiar role. To the outside observer, especially to people who knew you before, this process reads as a personality change. And they are not entirely wrong. Your personality is changing, not in the sense that your core nature is being replaced, but in the sense that the parts of your personality that were never actually yours, the compulsive agreeableness, the preemptive self-erasure, the instinct to make yourself smaller so that others could feel larger, those parts are being retired. And when those parts go, there is a period where the new self is visible but not yet fully articulated, where you are clearly no longer who you were but not yet fully who you are becoming. That period is uncomfortable for everyone. But it is most uncomfortable for the people who preferred the previous version, not because they loved that version more deeply, but because that version was easier to be around on their terms. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs to this stage of awakening. It is not the loneliness of isolation, not the loneliness of having no one around you. It is the loneliness of being fundamentally misread by people who think they know you, of doing the most courageous internal work of your life and having it received as withdrawal, of becoming more honest, more present, more genuinely yourself than you have ever been, and watching people who claim to love you struggle to recognize what they are seeing. That loneliness is real. It does not need to be minimized or reframed away. It is part of the cost of this particular awakening, and pretending otherwise does a disservice to everyone who is living inside it right now. What makes it bearable, and it is bearable, more than bearable, is understanding that the misreading is not about you. It is about the gap between who you were in someone's internal model of you and who you are actually becoming. People do not fall in love with you entirely. They fall in love with a version of you that they have constructed from their experience of you. And when you change significantly, their internal model breaks before their perception catches up. That gap, that lag between your reality and their outdated model, is where the accusations of coldness live, where the concern trolling about whether you are okay comes from, where the pressure to return to your former self disguises itself as care. There is a story that gets told about sensitive people. It gets told in classrooms and households and therapy offices and in the quiet internal dialogue of every person who ever felt too much in a world that consistently rewarded feeling less. The story goes like this: you are too much, you feel too deeply, you care too intensely, you take things too personally, you need to toughen up, build thicker skin, learn to detach, learn to not let things affect you the way they do. And because this story gets told early and gets told repeatedly and gets told by people whose opinions you depended on for your sense of safety, you believed it. You internalized it so completely that the sensitivity itself began to feel like a defect, like something that needed to be managed, contained, apologized for, like a design flaw in an otherwise functional person. That story was never true, not one word of it. What was true is that you arrived in environments that did not know what to do with the